What if the stories your ancestors told weren't just bedtime tales, but blueprints for an entire civilization? We often think of myths as fiction, but for ancient African societies, these narratives were the very fabric of their world. Discover how cosmic stories and warrior legends didn't just entertain, but built empires and shaped ethical frameworks. Forget everything you thought you knew about mythology. African myths weren't quaint fables, they were the strategic backbone of powerful civilizations. In this video, we'll unearth the profound impact of these foundational narratives, from the Dogon's cosmic wisdom to Dahomey's fierce warrior codes, revealing how storytelling wasn't just an art, but a tool of immense power. Ever wondered how societies are truly built, beyond laws and leaders? The answer might surprise you, and it lies in the ancient art of storytelling. Join us as we journey into African mythology, revealing how narratives, from the grand cosmic tales to epic warrior legends, didn't just entertain but fundamentally structured civilizations, codified ethics, and preserved history. You'll never look at a story the same way again. My beautiful global family, a huge, heartfelt welcome to African Mythologies Demystified, your new home for the deepest, richest, and most powerful stories ever told on this continent. From the ancient wisdom of the Dogon stars to the thunder of Shango, from Anansi's clever web to the sacred tales of the Zulu and Yoruba, from the queens of Dahomey to the spirits of the Congo Basin, we are about to dive into the soul of Africa, one myth at a time. Whether you're joining us from Lagos, London, New York, Nairobi, Sao Paulo, Tokyo, Paris, Johannesburg, or anywhere else on this beautiful planet, you are now part of this circle, and thank you for being here. If these stories move you, teach you, or make your spirit dance, please do these 3 simple things. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear Africa's true voice, and subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss a new journey. Together, let's bring the fire of African mythology back to the world. Welcome home. The ancestors are smiling. See you in the comments. Tell me where in the world you're watching from. With love and ancient magic, your name, African Mythologies Demystified. Chapter 1, Part 1. The Blueprint of Being, Myth as Foundational Law. African mythology is often misunderstood in the modern world as a collection of charming stories, entertaining folktales, or simple narratives told by elders to amuse young listeners around the fire. Yet within African civilizations, myth has always served a deeper and more authoritative purpose. It functioned as the underlying architecture upon which society was built, the unwritten but universally known constitution that guided human behavior, social organization, spiritual life, legal responsibilities, and community values. It offered a blueprint for existence, shaping not only how people understood the world, but how they lived within it. This chapter examines this deeper function of myth, demonstrating how African cosmologies acted as foundational law, quietly powerful, widely accepted, and profoundly influential. To view African myths as foundational law is to understand that they operated as the earliest legal codes. Before societies had formal courts, government structures, or written law books, they already had stories that articulated the principles of justice, responsibility, leadership, kinship, morality, and social harmony. These stories were transmitted orally from generation to generation, not merely for entertainment but for instruction. Through myth, children learned who they were, where they came from, what their roles were within the community, and how they were expected to behave. Adults internalized the same stories as reminders of their obligations, and leaders relied on them to legitimize their authority. Myth was thus a binding force, shaping collective identity and ensuring continuity over centuries. At its core, African mythology functioned as a cultural compass. It directed people toward behaviors that protected the community and discouraged actions that threatened social unity. This guidance was not enforced through fear of earthly punishment alone, but through a deep belief that the cosmos itself operated within a sacred order. To break a communal rule was to disturb not only social peace but cosmic harmony. In this sense, myth acted as both law and theology, merging the moral and the spiritual into a single worldview. The law was sacred, because the origins of the law were found in sacred narrative. In many African societies, myths explained not only how the world began but also how the earliest ancestors established social order. These ancestors appeared in stories as archetypes whose actions created templates for future generations. If a myth described the first woman as compassionate, nurturing, and strong, then women in the society were encouraged to embody those same values. If the first leader was portrayed as wise and fair, then every chief or king was expected to follow that example. Myth provided a reference point for the community's ethical expectations and established a long line of continuity between past and present. One of the most powerful examples of myth functioning as law can be seen in the Akan culture of Ghana, particularly in the use of adinkra symbols. These symbols, which appear on textiles, pottery, logos, and architectural decorations, express entire moral philosophies through simple images. They compress complex ideas about justice, unity, strength, leadership, and responsibility into visual forms that everyone can recognize. For the Akan people, adinkra symbols are not decorative, they are expressions of societal laws and ethical expectations. They embody proverbs that carry the weight of cultural authority, guiding individuals on how to act, how to treat others, and how to uphold the community's values. The symbol known as Jai Nyame, for example, communicates the philosophical truth that God is the ultimate authority. It reminds the community that all human actions must be grounded in humility, reverence, and moral restraint. Because the divine sees all things, people are expected to behave ethically even when no one is watching. Another symbol, Sankofa, teaches the importance of learning from the past. It encourages individuals and communities to return to their roots, recover forgotten wisdom, and honor ancestral teachings. In this way, Sankofa acts as a cultural law urging continuity, remembrance, and accountability to history. Other symbols like Aya, representing endurance, and Eben, symbolizing protection and family love, also articulate duties and expectations. When an Akan person sees these symbols, they are reminded of the moral and social contract embedded within the community's worldview. In a society where literacy was not widespread, the ability to encode law within story and symbol was a sophisticated and effective system of governance. It ensured that no one, regardless of age or status, was excluded from understanding the principles that governed their lives. The law was not distant or inaccessible, it lived in daily speech, in proverbs, in art, in ritual, and in collective memory. African mythologies were therefore dynamic legal systems that shaped behavior more effectively than written constitutions might have done. Creation myths across Africa further reinforce the idea of myth as foundational law. These stories often begin with chaos, darkness, or an undifferentiated world lacking form and purpose. Out of this primordial disorder, a divine being or ancestral figure brings structure, balance, and meaning. This creative act becomes the basis for social order. If the world emerged from chaos into harmony, then humans are expected to protect that harmony. If the first ancestors respected the divine instructions and lived in unity, then the community is obligated to do the same. Creation stories teach that order is fragile, that harmony is sacred, and that humans must uphold the cosmic balance through proper conduct. Many African creation myths describe a time when humans lived close to the divine realm but lost that closeness due to disobedience or disrespect. This moment of separation becomes the earliest example of wrongdoing and serves as a warning about the consequences of moral failure. A broken rule does not simply disrupt social life, it disrupts the entire cosmic arrangement. Myths like these reinforce the idea that moral laws are not arbitrary, they are woven into the fabric of the universe itself. To do good is to align with the cosmos, and to do wrong is to invite disorder. This worldview created societies that valued cooperation, mutual respect, and a strong sense of responsibility. Within this framework, leadership emerged not as a matter of personal ambition but as a sacred duty. Many African myths depict kings, chiefs, or community elders as descendants of divine or semi-divine ancestors. Their authority was therefore grounded not in physical dominance but in spiritual legitimacy. A leader was expected to embody the virtues of the ancestral figure from whom they descended. If a mythic ancestor brought order to the world, then a leader was required to bring order to the community. If an ancestor was known for justice or compassion, then leaders had to uphold these qualities. Myth thus created a standard against which leadership could be evaluated. When leaders failed to uphold these responsibilities, rituals were performed to restore balance, sometimes even involving their removal from power. This demonstrates how myth functioned not only as a source of authority but also as a mechanism of accountability. In many African societies, elders held significant authority, and this authority was justified through myth. Elders were believed to be closer to the ancestors, possessing wisdom that came from years of experience and spiritual maturity. Myths often portrayed the first elders as the receivers of divine knowledge, which they passed down to younger generations. This established a clear social rule: elders must be respected, not simply because they have lived longer, but because they carry within them the memory and authority of the ancestors. Their counsel was therefore not considered personal opinion but an extension of ancestral law. Through myth, respect for elders became not just a social custom but a moral obligation tied to cosmic order. Gender roles were also shaped by myth. Stories about the earliest men and women often explained how responsibilities were divided and why certain tasks belonged to one gender or another. While some myths reinforced patriarchal structures, many others highlighted the power, wisdom, and indispensability of women. The Yoruba stories of Oshun, for example, depict her as the only female among the original divine forces sent to create the world. When the male deities failed in their mission, it was Oshun's contribution that brought balance and beauty to creation. Such myths established a cultural understanding that women were essential to societal harmony, spiritual insight, and leadership. They did not merely complement men, they were central to the functioning of society. Through this narrative, gender relations were framed as reciprocal rather than hierarchical. Myth also shaped the relationship between humans and nature. Because many African creation stories describe the earth, animals, rivers, and mountains as the work of divine beings or the embodiment of spiritual forces, nature was regarded as sacred. This belief led to environmental laws that protected certain forests, rivers, or species considered holy. To harm them was to commit a spiritual offense. African societies thus developed a sustainable relationship with the natural world long before modern environmental science existed. Myth acted as an ecological constitution, teaching people that their survival depended on respecting the earth. Chapter 1 Part 2. The Blueprint of Being, Myth as Foundational Law. Myths not only defined external structures of society but also shaped the inner life of individuals. They offered psychological guidance, emotional grounding, and spiritual meaning that helped people understand their place in the world. From childhood, individuals absorbed lessons encoded in stories, internalizing them as personal laws that governed their behavior, ambitions, fears, and values. A child raised on a creation myth that emphasizes unity and cooperation grows into an adult who instinctively believes in collective responsibility. A person who hears stories of ancestors who overcame adversity with courage develops resilience as a moral expectation. These internalized teachings formed a moral compass that guided individuals long before they encountered formal leadership or social expectations. Myth therefore became the foundational curriculum of personal character. As children listened to stories told by grandparents, elders, or professional storytellers, they were not simply being entertained. They were receiving the earliest version of civic education. They learned why generosity matters, why greed is dangerous, why obedience preserves harmony, why courage is honorable, and why disrespect disrupts both social and spiritual order. In this way, myth taught ethics without having to state ethical rules explicitly. Stories that depicted tricksters suffering consequences taught children the dangers of dishonesty or pride. Narratives that showed heroes triumphing through perseverance taught the value of hard work and resilience. These lessons, though wrapped in imaginative storytelling, remained deeply practical and applicable to daily life. In most African societies, the community was the central unit of life. Individualism was secondary to collective well-being, and myth reinforced this perspective by consistently presenting characters whose success depended on cooperation, humility, or loyalty. Even stories that involved solitary heroes often emphasized that the hero ultimately served the community, not personal glory. When a hero defeated a monster or solved a crisis, the victory was for the entire group, and the hero's strength was understood as a gift from the ancestors or the divine, not a personal accomplishment. This worldview discouraged selfishness and promoted social harmony. Myth became the emotional and moral foundation upon which African communal life thrived. The idea that myth served as foundational law is further illustrated by the way communities interpreted punishment and reward. In many myths, wrongdoing resulted not in arbitrary punishment but in consequences that restored balance. If a character disobeyed the gods, the punishment served to correct the cosmic imbalance created by the act. This model taught that justice was not about revenge but restoration. In real society, this idea manifested in justice systems that focused on reconciliation rather than harsh punishment. When disputes arose, elders relied on ancestral principles encoded in myth to guide mediation. The goal was to restore harmony between parties and within the community. Myth thus influenced legal structures in ways that promoted peace, forgiveness, and balance. The Yoruba, for example, practiced a system of justice that emphasized restoration, guided by narratives in which the orishas corrected human behavior through moral lessons rather than destruction. A person who violated a law might be required to apologize publicly, compensate the injured party, or perform a ritual cleansing. These practices reflected the underlying belief that wrongdoing was a disturbance of spiritual equilibrium. Mythic stories provided the philosophical justification for this approach to justice. Because the cosmos in myth responds to human actions, real societies made decisions consistent with this cosmic model. Another significant function of myth as foundational law can be seen in its ability to legitimize power structures. Many African societies recognized several layers of leadership, from family heads and clan leaders to chiefs and kings. The justification for each type of leadership was found in myth. It was believed that the first ancestors appointed certain families or clans to carry specific responsibilities. Leadership, therefore, was not a personal achievement but a continuation of ancestral duty. This belief created stability, as leadership transitions were grounded in spiritual legitimacy rather than competition. For example, among the Shilluk of South Sudan, the king was understood to be the descendant of Nikang, a legendary figure who brought order and unity to the people. Nikang's story not only established the king's authority but also clarified the moral obligations of the ruler. A Shilluk king was expected to embody the wisdom, courage, and compassion of his ancestor. If a king behaved unjustly, it was believed that Nikang's spirit would withdraw support, compromising the king's legitimacy. Myth thus operated as a political constitution that outlined both rights and responsibilities. Furthermore, myth shaped social expectations around marriage, family, and kinship. Stories about the first families often highlighted the importance of loyalty, mutual respect, and complementarity. While family roles varied among ethnic groups, myths consistently emphasized the sacredness of family ties. They taught that marriage was not just a union of individuals but a merging of lineages and ancestral spirits. Violating marital responsibilities, such as through infidelity or neglect, was considered not only a personal failure but a disturbance of ancestral balance. In this context, myth influenced marriage laws, divorce procedures, inheritance customs, and family obligations. Family heads, who acted as custodians of ancestral memory, used mythocratic principles to resolve family conflicts and ensure harmony. The role of community rituals further demonstrates how myth functioned as a guiding framework. Most rituals, whether they involved initiation, harvest celebrations, funerals, or healing ceremonies, were grounded in myth. These stories explained why certain rituals were necessary, what they symbolized, and how they maintained cosmic balance. During initiation ceremonies, for example, young people were taught the myths of their community as part of their transition into adulthood. This education served as a moral foundation, reminding them of ancestral expectations. Without myth, these rituals would have lacked meaning, but with myth, they became central to the community's identity and continuity. Sacred spaces, such as groves, rivers, mountains, and shrines, were often tied to mythic events involving ancestors or deities. These places were protected not by written law but by the authority of myth. People avoided disrespecting these spaces because doing so would offend the spirits tied to them. The preservation of sacred spaces thus depended on shared belief in the mythic stories behind them. As a result, Myth indirectly protected the environment by discouraging harmful practices in sacred areas. Forests remained untouched because they were believed to house ancestral spirits. Rivers remained clean because they were seen as the dwelling places of water deities. In this way, myth served as an environmental legal code that safeguarded natural resources. Even in economic life, myth provided guidelines. Many African communities practiced systems of communal ownership, where land belonged not to individuals but to the whole group, under the guardianship of ancestors. Myths about the origin of land emphasized that the earth was a sacred gift, entrusted to humans for responsible stewardship. This understanding shaped land laws, inheritance systems, and the distribution of resources. Greed was condemned not just socially but spiritually, as it violated the divine intention for land to be shared fairly. Economic justice was thus framed in moral and cosmological terms, and wealth was viewed not as personal property but as a communal trust. The presence of trickster figures in African mythology reveals another dimension of myth as foundational lore. Trickster characters such as Anansi the spider, Legba, or the hare often challenged social norms through mischief and cunning. Their stories explored the consequences of greed, dishonesty, and recklessness, serving as warnings to the community. The tricksters' failures taught moral lessons, while their occasional successes highlighted the value of intelligence, creativity, and adaptability. Rather than presenting law as rigid or oppressive, myth showed that legal and ethical systems had flexibility and space for learning. People learned that mistakes, though costly, could lead to wisdom. Trickster stories thus acted as moral mirrors, reflecting human flaws and encouraging self-reflection. Ultimately, the power of African myth as foundational lore lay in its ability to unify knowledge, spirituality, politics, ethics, and culture into a single coherent worldview. It was not separate from daily life but woven into everything: speech, art, ritual, family, law, and leadership. It gave African societies a deep sense of identity and continuity, connecting each generation to the first ancestors and reminding them of their duties. Through myth, people understood not just how to live, but why they lived the way they did. Myth created order out of chaos: social order, moral order, and cosmic order. It served as an invisible constitution that shaped civilizations, held communities together, and guided future generations. Chapter 1, Part 3. The Blueprint of Being: Myth as Foundational Lore. The deep relationship between myth and lore is also evident in how African societies approached conflict resolution. Long before the introduction of formal courts, communities relied on elder councils whose authority was grounded in mythic wisdom. Elders invoked ancestral narratives to settle disputes, reminding parties of their deeper obligations to each other and to the community. A conflict was never seen as an isolated event. It was a rupture in the social fabric that had to be mended through processes rooted in cultural memory. By telling specific myths related to generosity, humility, betrayal, or cooperation, elders guided individuals back to the moral path established by the ancestors. These storytelling practices had legal consequences because they shaped decisions about restitution, apology, and reconciliation. The power of the law came not from coercion but from shared belief. People obeyed the decision of elders because they recognized the ancestral authority behind those decisions. Myth therefore acted as the supreme court of cultural logic. The role of myth in education extended far beyond childhood lessons. Every major life transition, from birth to adulthood to old age, was framed by stories that clarified the individual's responsibilities at each stage. Initiation rites, for instance, were filled with mythological teachings. During the days or weeks of seclusion, initiates were taught the origin of their people, the principles of bravery and loyalty upheld by their ancestors, and their future obligations to the community. A boy entering manhood learned the myths that defined proper conduct, generosity, and courage, while a girl learned stories that emphasized wisdom, compassion, and the strength of womanhood. These teachings were not optional, they were integrated into the very structure of adulthood. One could not be recognized as a full member of the community unless they had been grounded in the mythic foundations of their culture. The importance of mythological knowledge became even more apparent during communal celebrations and festivals. Harvest festivals, New Year rituals, ancestral commemorations, and ceremonies for rainmaking or healing were all framed by mythic narratives. These stories provided the reason for the celebration and set the expectations for proper behavior during the ritual. Participants understood that their actions were not personal choices but contributions toward the maintenance of cosmic balance. A celebration was not a casual event, it was a reenactment of mythic time, a moment when people joined the ancestors and the divine in renewing the world. This connection between story and ritual showed how myth governed collective emotion, ensuring that joy, gratitude, mourning, or hope were expressed in culturally meaningful ways. Myth also influenced artistic expression, shaping the forms and symbols used in sculpture, music, dance, and architecture. Art was not created for aesthetic purposes alone, it was a medium through which lore and memory were preserved. Masks used in ceremonies represented ancestors or spirits, whose myths dictated when the mask could be worn and by whom. The structure of traditional houses reflected cosmological ideas about the world's organization. Drum patterns communicated messages tied to historical narratives. Even clothing carried symbolic meaning rooted in myth. Through art, mythic laws became visible and tangible. People encountered them daily, whether through the symbols on their garments, the design of their homes, or the rhythms that marked community events. The preservation of lineages and social groups also depended on myth. Many African societies organized themselves into clans, each tracing its ancestry back to a mythic figure such as an animal, a natural force, or a legendary ancestor. These origin stories shaped marriage laws, inheritance practices, and clan responsibilities. For example, if a clan believed its ancestor was a lion, members might be forbidden to kill lions or eat their meat. This rule was not a simple preference but a law grounded in sacred ancestry. Marriage between members of the same clan was often prohibited because it violated the mythic understanding of kinship. The clan's identity, duties, and privileges were all defined by its origin story. Myth therefore served as the constitutional basis for social organization, ensuring that clan relations remained structured and meaningful. One of the most profound aspects of African mythology is its insistence on balance between humans and nature, between individuals and community, between leaders and followers, and between the living and the dead. This concept of balance functioned as a legal principle that shaped nearly every aspect of society. When natural disasters occurred, they were interpreted as signs of imbalance caused by human wrongdoing. When social conflict erupted, it was seen as evidence that someone had violated ancestral principles. Rituals of cleansing, reconciliation, or sacrifice sought to restore the balance broken by harmful actions. Within this worldview, the law was never static, it was dynamic, adjusting to maintain harmony. Myth provided the eternal framework within which these adjustments could be made. Even today, the influence of myth as foundational law persists. Many African communities still rely on traditional authorities, whose legitimacy is rooted in ancestral narratives. Cultural festivals continue to reenact stories that reinforce identity and social cohesion. Symbols like the adinkra remain potent reminders of ethical principles. Although written constitutions now govern most African nations, the deeper ethical and spiritual fabric of society continues to draw strength from mythic memory. When people speak of Ubuntu in southern Africa, the belief in shared humanity and mutual responsibility, they are invoking a principle far older than modern law codes, one rooted in ancient mythic understandings of interconnectedness. When communities speak of ancestors guiding their actions, they are invoking the same principles that shaped pre-colonial legal systems. Myth therefore remains the quiet foundation beneath modern African civilization, continuing to influence behavior, identity, and morality even in contemporary contexts. Whether consciously or unconsciously, people still carry within them the ancestral laws inherited through myth, the value of unity, the sacredness of life, the importance of respect, and the belief that humans are part of a vast cosmic order. These ideas form the spiritual DNA of African cultures, shaping decision-making, conflict resolution, community development, and personal identity. In conclusion, African mythology was and remains far more than a collection of stories. It is the foundational law that shaped civilizations, structured societies, guided families, informed leadership, and grounded spirituality. By presenting cosmological truths, social responsibilities, and ethical principles in narrative form, myth provided a legal and moral framework that governed life in profound ways. It taught people how to live in harmony with each other and with the universe. It created a sense of continuity across generations, connecting the living with the ancestral past. It offered a worldview in which law, morality, history, and spirituality were intertwined. Through myth, African societies moved from chaos to order, from undefined existence to meaningful community, establishing enduring civilizations built on the power of story. Myth remains the blueprint of being a living constitution shaped not by ink on paper but by memory, imagination, and the timeless wisdom of the ancestors. Chapter 2. Echoes of Ancestors, History Etched in Narrative. Across the vast landscapes of Africa, history has never been confined to stone tablets, archived manuscripts, or the silent shelves of libraries. It has breathed with the living, traveled with the wanderers, and settled in the hearts of those entrusted with memory. Long before the rise of written chronicles, African societies developed sophisticated systems of historical preservation, encoded not through ink but through story. These stories, woven into mythological cycles, genealogies, praise poetry, and epic narratives, became the continent's most enduring archives. To speak of African mythology, therefore, is not merely to speak of imaginative tales crafted for entertainment, it is to examine a dynamic form of historiography through which communities traced their past, justified their present, and projected their future. In these narratives, the voices of ancestors remain alive, guiding generations in the art of remembering. African oral tradition functioned as a cultural vessel that carried the identity of entire peoples across centuries. In societies where memory served as the primary means of continuity, storytellers were more than narrators. They were custodians of the community's consciousness, individuals entrusted with the delicate responsibility of preserving historical truth while weaving it into forms that could be easily recalled and retold. The gift of narrative ensured that even when villages burned, kingdoms rose and fell, and generations passed away, the kernel of communal memory persisted. Myths and historical stories were crafted in rhythmic and symbolic forms so that they could be memorized, performed, and transmitted without distortion. Rhythm became the anchor of memory, metaphor the vessel of wisdom, and performance the ritual through which knowledge survived. In this way, the African storyteller occupied the role of historian, philosopher, moral instructor, and spiritual guide. Their narratives captured not only what happened, but what it meant, why it mattered, and how future generations should interpret the lessons hidden within. The boundaries between myth and history were fluid, not because Africans lacked an understanding of factual truth, but because they understood that historical memory was strengthened when infused with meaning. What mattered was not merely that an event took place, but that it carried implications for identity, values, and destiny. For this reason, African myths often encode migration patterns, shifts in political power, climatic changes, genealogies of rulers, and accounts of heroic struggles that shaped the community. As long as the story lived, the people lived. A profound example of narrative as both myth and history can be seen in the traditions of West Africa, where storytellers known as griots served as the backbone of historical continuity. These individuals held in their minds centuries of genealogies, major events, conflicts, alliances, and social transformations. Their memories were recited during ceremonies, political meetings, coronations, and rites of passage. A griot could trace the lineage of a king back several generations without references to written scrolls. The body itself became the archive. The voice became the document. The story became the unbroken chain linking past and present. No narrative illustrates this role more powerfully than the legendary epic of Sundiata, a monumental chronicle that recounts the rise of the Mali Empire. Though rich in supernatural elements, it remains one of Africa's most historically grounded epics. The story recounts the life of Sundiata Keita, a prince who rose from physical disability and exile to unite the fragmented Mandinka peoples and establish one of the greatest empires in African history. Although the epic contains scenes of magical transformations, prophetic visions, and heroic feats beyond the boundaries of natural law, its core corresponds to documented historical events, including political rivalries, battles for supremacy, and the formation of new systems of governance. In the Epic of Sundiata, myth does not distort history, it elevates it, making memory compelling and unforgettable. The narrative structure itself reflects an African logic of remembering, where historical events are framed in cosmic significance. Sundiata's birth is portrayed as the fulfillment of a prophecy, not to diminish its historicity but to underscore the idea that leaders are shaped by destiny and communal need. His disability, often interpreted symbolically, serves as a metaphor for delayed greatness. His eventual triumph over the sorcerer king Sumaro represents not merely a military victory but the triumph of unity, justice, and divine order over tyranny and chaos. Through the epic, the Mali Empire's political legitimacy is grounded in narrative authority. The story becomes a charter of identity, a justification for unity, and a testament to the enduring power of collective memory. The belief in time before time, prevalent in many African societies, reinforces this historical function of myth. Rather than perceiving time as a single linear thread, African cosmologies often depict it as layered, with a sacred past existing alongside the mundane present. This sacred past includes events that may have occurred in historical reality but are remembered through symbolic or supernatural frameworks. Such events become foundational narratives that legitimize current traditions, power structures, and social hierarchies. When a clan claims descent from an ancestral hero who conversed with spirits or overcame supernatural challenges, the claim is not necessarily judged by its empirical accuracy. Instead, its value lies in the cultural role it plays in defining lineage, authority, and belonging. Myth becomes the anchor that secures identity to a deeper well of meaning. Through such stories, migration histories are preserved with remarkable clarity. Many communities recount their origins through myths that trace long journeys across rivers, forests, deserts, and mountains. The Maasai, for example, remember their movements from the lower Nile region to present-day Kenya and Tanzania through a sacred narrative that blends divine guidance with human perseverance. The Zulu remember their origins in the story of the reed, emerging as a people from a symbolic place of creation. These narratives serve as historical maps, guiding contemporary communities in understanding where they came from and how they arrived at their present landscapes. Even when embellished with mythological motifs, these stories reliably encode geographical roots, ecological transitions, and encounters with other groups. Lineage, too, is etched in the narrative form, becoming a living testament to ancestry. African societies place profound importance on knowing one's genealogy, not only for social organization but for spiritual continuity. To forget an ancestor is to sever a link in the chain of identity. Mythology helps prevent this forgetting by embedding lineage in compelling narratives. Names are sung in praise poems, recited in ceremonies, and invoked in rituals. A living person carries the echoes of those who came before, and through narrative, these echoes remain audible. Even political power derives legitimacy from this continuity, as leaders often trace their authority to ancestral heroes, mythical founders, or sacred bloodlines whose stories have been preserved across generations. In many communities, mythological cycles served as archives of historical events such as droughts, wars, famines, or periods of prosperity. Stories personify these events through symbolic characters, allowing communities to reflect on the causes and consequences of past experiences. A devastating drought might be remembered as the anger of a neglected spirit or the result of a community's moral failure. Though symbolic, such stories often coincide with ecological records and archaeological evidence of climatic shifts. They become coded memories that warn future generations about the importance of stewardship, unity, and adherence to communal values. The function of myth as historical record is also evident in how African societies interpreted political transitions. The rise and fall of kingdoms were often narrated through cycles of divine approval or disfavor. A ruler who led with justice was remembered as having lived in harmony with the ancestors. One who ruled with cruelty was believed to have disturbed the cosmic balance, leading to downfall. While supernatural language frames these narratives, their historical core documents patterns of governance, conflicts between clans, and the shifting sands of political authority. Myth thus becomes a mirror through which history is interpreted, judged, and preserved. The concept of ancestral presence plays a central role in legitimizing traditions within African societies. The ancestors are not distant historical figures confined to memory, they are active participants in daily life, guiding, warning, and shaping the destiny of the living. Their stories preserve not only the past but the moral frameworks necessary for maintaining social order. When a ritual is performed, it is not merely an act of devotion, it is a reenactment of ancestral narratives that continue to define communal identity. When a festival is celebrated, it becomes a living pageant of historical memory, performed not for the sake of entertainment but to ensure the continuity of the story. African mythology therefore operates on two intertwined planes. It preserves historical truths while infusing them with symbolic depth that reveals their ultimate significance. This dual structure ensures that history is not merely remembered but understood, not simply recited but lived. A people who know their story know themselves, and a people who lose their story lose their way. African societies understood this deeply and therefore developed narrative traditions that could withstand time, colonization, migration, and cultural disruption. Even today, these narratives continue to shape identity. Modern historians, linguists, and anthropologists draw heavily on oral traditions to reconstruct pre-colonial African history. What was once dismissed as myth is now recognized as a sophisticated form of historical methodology. The stories of ancestors guide contemporary Africans in reclaiming their past and redefining their place in the world. They remind communities that history does not merely exist in documents but in the living rhythms of speech, memory, and imagination. Through narrative, the past becomes present, and the present becomes part of a continuous stream flowing into the future. In this sense, African mythology is not a relic of a bygone era but a vibrant, evolving force. Its echoes continue to resonate in music, literature, social rituals, and political expressions. The voice of the ancestor still speaks, not from forgotten ruins, but from the living archive of story. Chapter 3. The Spiritual Compass, Guiding Belief and Ritual. Across the African continent, spirituality has always existed as a multidimensional reality, woven seamlessly into the fabric of daily life. For many African societies, the material world and the spiritual world are not separate domains but intertwined layers of one existence. Mythology becomes the thread that binds these layers together, offering a map that explains how the visible and invisible interact. Through story, communities interpret the rhythms of nature, the mysteries of life and death, the origins of moral duty, and the cosmic forces that shape human destiny. These myths do not merely describe spiritual beliefs, they give structure to ritual practices, define relationships with divine beings, and guide individuals in navigating the challenges of existence. In this way, African mythology becomes a spiritual compass, orienting communities within a cosmos charged with meaning. The relationship between myth and spirituality in Africa is grounded in the belief that the universe is animated by an unseen force that sustains life and connects all beings. Myths articulate the nature of this force, presenting the world as a living organism in which ancestors, deities, humans, animals, and natural elements all share profound relationships. This interconnectedness forms the basis of African cosmology, and mythology provides the narrative language through which communities express their understanding of the divine. Every mountain, river, forest, and storm carries spiritual significance because mythological stories have endowed them with meaning. Nature is not an inert backdrop but a participant in the sacred drama of existence. In many African societies, the belief in a supreme creator is universal, though the creator is often distant or unseen. Myths describe how this supreme being brought the world into existence, shaped humanity from clay, spoke creation into being, or descended momentarily to prepare the earth before retreating into the heavens. Although the specific details vary across cultures, these stories share a common theme: the universe is intentional, and human beings exist within a larger cosmic order. Creation myths perform an essential function by explaining how this order emerged from chaos. They frame the world as a space infused with purpose, governed by moral laws, and sustained by spiritual energy. Rituals associated with birth, death, harvest, and seasons are often grounded in these foundational narratives, reflecting an understanding that human life unfolds within a sacred design. The connection between myth and ritual becomes even more visible in traditions that emphasize the presence of intermediaries between the supreme creator and humanity. These intermediaries, often referred to as spirits or deities, are understood as guardians of natural forces, moral principles, and human experiences. The Yoruba tradition of West Africa offers one of the most elaborate and influential examples of this cosmological structure. In Yoruba mythology, the Orishas function as divine manifestations of natural energies and human archetypes. They bridge the gap between the earthly realm and the spiritual world, embodying the principle of interconnectedness that defines Yoruba cosmology. Each Orisha possesses a distinct personality, symbolic color, ritual food, sacred animal, and mythological narrative that explains their role in the universe. These stories reveal profound truths about human behavior, natural cycles, and the balance between order and disorder. For instance, Augun, the Orisha of iron and warfare, represents strength, sacrifice, and the turbulent power of transformation. His myths teach that creativity often emerges from struggle and that progress requires discipline and courage. Oshun, the Orisha of rivers, fertility, and love, symbolizes beauty, compassion, and the generative force of life. Her stories emphasize the importance of harmony, emotional intelligence, and nurturing relationships. Shango, associated with thunder and kingship, embodies justice, authority, and the fiery intensity of divine energy. His narratives remind communities that leadership requires responsibility and that unchecked power leads to destruction. These mythological biographies of the Orishas shape spiritual rituals, ceremonial dances, musical traditions, and moral expectations. When Yoruba communities perform rituals for prosperity, healing, or protection, they reenact the stories of the Orishas, invoking their presence through drums, chants, offerings, and symbolic gestures. Ritual becomes a form of communication with the divine, a reenactment of cosmic history, and a reaffirmation of communal identity. Through these narratives, individuals understand which spiritual forces govern their destiny and how to live in harmony with them. The Orishas thus provide a spiritual framework that guides everyday decisions, from interpersonal relationships to community leadership. Beyond the Yoruba, similar spiritual frameworks appear across the continent. In many East African societies, myths surrounding ancestral spirits guide rituals of mediation and reconciliation. Communities such as the Kikuyu, Dinka, Shona, and Zulu understand ancestors as active participants in human life, capable of blessing, guiding, or warning the living. Myths recount the ancestors' deeds, virtues, and missteps, offering moral guidance that continues long after their passing. Rituals involving libations, sacrifices, prayers, or dances ensure that the bond between the living and the dead remains unbroken. When a family faces hardship, they turn to ancestral stories to understand the spiritual causes behind their challenges and the rituals required to restore balance. Mythology thus structures the rhythms of daily life, from farming seasons to marriage ceremonies, ensuring that all actions align with cosmic harmony. Sacred spaces play a central role in this spiritual landscape. African myths frequently explain the origins of hills, rivers, caves, and forests as sites where divine beings once walked, where ancestors ascended to the heavens, or where pivotal events in creation took place. These stories transform the physical environment into a spiritual geography. A waterfall becomes the dwelling place of a spirit, a mountain becomes the throne of a deity, a grove becomes a sanctuary for rituals of healing and divination. Sacred spaces are not chosen arbitrarily, they are revealed through narrative. Temples, shrines, and altars are therefore built in places believed to hold spiritual energy, and their architecture reflects the community's mythological worldview. The placement of an altar, the direction of a doorway, or the design of a ceremonial enclosure may correspond to specific mythological principles, such as the cardinal points of the universe, the journey of souls, or the hierarchy of spiritual beings. Festivals, too, are deeply informed by mythology. African festivals are not merely cultural celebrations but reenactments of sacred stories that bind communities across generations. Whether celebrating the New Yam Festival among the Igbo, the Oru Festival among the Shona, or the Odwira Festival among the Akan, these events retell mythological narratives through processions, costumes, songs, and dances. Each gesture echoes an ancient story, allowing participants to step symbolically into the world of the ancestors and reaffirm their identity as custodians of tradition. Through festivals, myth becomes a living experience, renewing communal bonds and revitalizing spiritual awareness. Rituals surrounding life transitions also draw heavily from mythological frameworks. Birth rituals invoke creation myths to welcome a child into the world, affirming their connection to ancestors and deities. Initiation ceremonies for adolescents reenact stories of transformation, teaching the responsibilities of adulthood and the sacredness of community membership. Marriage rituals mirror myths of union between divine beings, symbolizing the harmony required to maintain balance in the universe. Funeral rites dramatize the journey of the soul, guided by myths that describe the path to the ancestral realm and the responsibilities of the living in ensuring safe passage. Through these rituals, mythology offers comfort, continuity, and meaning, turning personal milestones into communal expressions of spiritual truth. African mythology's role as a spiritual compass extends beyond ritual practice into the realm of moral understanding. Myths articulate the spiritual consequences of human choices, revealing how actions reverberate through the visible and invisible worlds. When a story describes a character punished for greed, dishonesty, or arrogance, it communicates the spiritual principle that imbalance disrupts harmony. When another character gains wisdom, prosperity, or blessings due to humility, generosity, or courage, it illustrates the moral laws woven into the universe. These lessons are not abstract ideals but spiritually grounded realities that guide individual and collective behavior. The spiritual compass provided by African mythology also shapes concepts of health and healing. Illness is often understood as a disruption of spiritual balance, caused by neglecting rituals, violating taboos, or failing to honor ancestors. Healers, diviners, and spiritual specialists use mythological knowledge to diagnose these disruptions and prescribe remedies that restore harmony. Ritual healing involves more than physical treatment. It serves as a reconnect ion to the spiritual forces that sustain life. Herbs, chants, prayers, and symbolic objects all play a role in aligning the patient's body, spirit, and community. In this way, healing becomes a spiritual journey guided by mythological wisdom that has been passed down across generations. Even today, African spirituality continues to draw strength from mythological foundations. Modern practitioners of traditional religions in Nigeria, South Africa, Ghana, Tanzania, and other regions still rely on ancestral stories to guide their rituals and interpret experiences. The Orisha traditions have also spread globally through the African diaspora, influencing spiritual practices in Brazil, Cuba, Haiti, and the United States. These traditions demonstrate the resilience of African mythologies, their ability to adapt to new environments, and their enduring relevance in guiding spiritual expression. The stories that once shaped the spiritual compass of ancient communities continue to illuminate the path for millions of people worldwide, revealing a universal human longing for meaning, connection, and transcendence. African mythology therefore stands as a profound spiritual framework that integrates belief, ritual, morality, and cosmology into a single living narrative. It offers a vision of the universe in which every action reverberates through time and space, every person carries a divine spark, and every ritual reflects an ancient story that continues to shape human destiny. To follow this spiritual compass is to walk in harmony with the ancestors, to honor the deities, and to live with awareness of the sacred dimensions of existence. Through myth, African societies cultivate a spirituality that is both deeply rooted in tradition and expansive enough to guide future generations. Chapter 3: Continuation. The Spiritual Compass, Guiding Belief and Ritual. As African societies developed their spiritual frameworks, mythology remained the most powerful tool for interpreting the complex relationship between humans and the unseen. It provided not only an explanation of spiritual forces but also practical guidance for how individuals should orient themselves within this cosmic landscape. This created a worldview in which every action possessed spiritual meaning, and every ritual served as a bridge between the physical and the supernatural. Through these narratives, communities learned that life was not simply lived for oneself but participated in a larger spiritual ecosystem that demanded respect, reverence, and reciprocity. The stories of gods, ancestors, spirits, and cosmic beings illustrated the delicate balance required to maintain harmony in the world. One of the most profound manifestations of this balance appears in the concept of destiny, which is central to many African spiritual traditions. Destiny is not viewed as a rigid path that eliminates human agency, but rather as a spiritual blueprint that each person must discover and nurture. In the Yoruba tradition, for example, the myth of Ori explains that every soul selects its destiny before birth, choosing the life lessons it must experience. This choice is made in the presence of divine witnesses, who ensure that the soul's decision reflects its growth. Once a person is born, however, they forget this choice, and the task of spiritual growth becomes a process of rediscovery. Rituals, prayers, divination, and storytelling are used to guide individuals back toward the path their soul originally selected. In this way, myth gives meaning to human struggle, turning confusion into clarity and despair into purpose. The practice of divination becomes a crucial spiritual tool within this framework. Whether performed through cowrie shells, bones, ancestral mediums, or specialized oracles, divination is grounded in mythological narratives that explain how divine beings first revealed these techniques to humanity. In many West African traditions, it is said that Orunmila, the Orisha of wisdom and prophecy, descended from the heavens with the sacred Ifa system, teaching humans how to communicate with the spiritual world. Every verse recited during divination carries a mythological origin, telling of past events, spiritual conflicts, or moral lessons that mirror the seeker's current situation. Thus, the process is not simply about predicting the future, it is about interpreting the present through stories that have guided countless generations. Through divination, individuals gain access to ancestral insight, learning how to align themselves with the spiritual forces that shape their destiny. Myths also guide the community's understanding of morality, particularly the relationship between humans and spiritual beings. In many African societies, spiritual laws are believed to predate human laws, and myths articulate the consequences of violating these cosmic rules. A story about a farmer who disrespected a sacred grove may serve as a warning against environmental destruction. A tale about a hunter who ignored spiritual taboos and suffered misfortune reinforces the importance of humility and reverence. These mythical warnings are deeply embedded in ritual practices, ensuring that communities live in harmony with the land that supports them. Environmental conservation, therefore, is not a modern invention. It has been encoded in African mythology for centuries, expressed through rituals that protect rivers, forests, animals, and ancestral sites. These mythological principles also shape communal identity, especially during moments of crisis. When misfortune strikes, such as drought, disease, conflict, or social disharmony, communities turn to myth and ritual to interpret the disruption. They consult stories describing how similar challenges were handled in the past, reaffirming the belief that spiritual imbalance often manifests physically. Ritual specialists perform ceremonies designed to restore harmony, drawing upon sacred narratives that explain the origins of suffering and the pathways to healing. In this sense, mythology becomes a psychological tool, helping communities navigate fear and uncertainty through familiar symbolic frameworks. The ritual act of renewing the world, which appears in many African societies, reflects the belief that spiritual balance must be periodically restored through ceremonial reenactments of creation myths. By participating in these rituals, people symbolically assist the gods in recreating order from chaos, reaffirming their responsibility as co-custodians of the universe. The connection between myth and healing is especially visible in the role of traditional healers. These healers do not simply treat physical symptoms, they diagnose the spiritual roots of suffering by drawing upon mythological knowledge passed down through lineage. Their craft is infused with stories that explain the spiritual nature of herbs, ritual symbols, trance states, and ceremonial techniques. A plant used to cure fever may have a mythological story describing how it was gifted to humanity by a compassionate spirit. A ritual for cleansing misfortune may reenact the myth of a deity who once washed away impurity from the world. Through myth, the healer becomes not only a medical practitioner but also a spiritual mediator, guiding the patient through a process of reconnect with the divine. Myth also informs African concepts of leadership. Kingship and political authority are often framed within narratives of divine selection, ancestral blessing, or cosmic responsibility. Many African kings are regarded not merely as political figures but as spiritual intermediaries responsible for maintaining balance between the human community and the spiritual world. Their coronations involve elaborate rituals that reenact mythological events, marking the leader as a participant in the cosmic order. When a king is unjust, myths warn that the land itself may suffer, crops fail, rivers dry, or conflict arises, reflecting the spiritual principle that leaders are custodians of communal harmony. These beliefs continue to influence leadership structures today, even in modern political systems, where traditional authorities retain spiritual significance. In addition to shaping rituals and belief, African mythology profoundly influences artistic expression. Dance, music, sculpture, and textile patterns often reference mythological characters, spiritual forces, and ancestral beings. A dance performed during initiation ceremonies may reenact the journey of a mythical hero who crossed into adulthood through trials and wisdom. A mask worn during a festival may represent a spirit associated with fertility, rain, or war. The rhythm of drums may mimic the heartbeat of the universe, as described in creation myths. Through art, mythology becomes visible, tangible, and participatory, allowing the community to embody sacred narratives in physical form. Art does not merely decorate life, it communicates spiritual truths that transcend the limitations of language. The myths that guide spirituality also shape African understandings of death and the afterlife. In many traditions, death is not an end but a transition into a new form of existence. Myths describe the journey of the soul across rivers, mountains, or spiritual gates, often guided by ancestral beings who welcome the departed into their realm. Rituals surrounding death ensure that the soul is properly prepared for this journey, honoring mythological teachings about the responsibilities of both the living and the dead. Mourning ceremonies, cleansing rituals, and ancestral prayers all reflect the belief that the boundary between worlds is porous and that the living must maintain harmony with the unseen realm. Through these practices, mythology eases the pain of loss, offering comfort by situating death within a meaningful cosmic narrative. As African societies encountered globalization, colonization, and rapid social change, their spiritual myths faced immense pressures. Yet these stories have shown remarkable resilience, adapting to new circumstances without losing their foundational purpose. Today, many African Christians and Muslims continue to incorporate elements of traditional mythology into their spiritual lives, blending beliefs to create hybrid forms of worship that reflect both ancient and modern influences. Traditional festivals still attract participants from across the world, and diaspora communities continue to honor the myths and rituals of their ancestors. These enduring traditions demonstrate that African mythology remains a vital spiritual compass, guiding individuals and communities toward meaning in a rapidly changing world. Ultimately, African mythology offers a profound vision of life in which spirituality is not confined to temples, scriptures, or isolated rituals. It flows through every aspect of existence, shaping how people understand creation, destiny, morality, community, nature, and the afterlife. It provides a foundation for ritual practice, a framework for interpreting experience, and a lens through which individuals see their place in the universe. By telling the stories of gods, ancestors, spirits, and cosmic forces, African societies carve pathways for spiritual growth, ethical living, and communal harmony. Myth becomes the heartbeat of spiritual life, a compass that points toward wisdom, balance, and transcendence. Chapter 4. Moral Mazes and Ethical Frameworks, Living the Myth. African mythology extends far beyond the realm of spiritual cosmology or historical memory. It serves as a powerful ethical compass, shaping how individuals interpret right and wrong, navigate moral dilemmas, and uphold communal responsibility. Within many African societies, morality is not an abstract set of principles derived from legal codes or philosophical doctrines. Instead, morality is dynamic, practical, and deeply embedded in the narrative traditions that define the community. Through myth, people learn what it means to be human, what it means to belong, and what it means to choose wisely in the face of temptation or uncertainty. Myths do not merely describe ethical ideals, they dramatize them through characters, conflicts, successes, and failures, offering concrete pathways for responsible living. One of the most striking features of African ethical mythology is its emphasis on consequences. Actions do not occur in isolation but reverberate through the spiritual and social fabric of life. Myths illustrate this interconnectedness by presenting characters whose decisions bring harmony or chaos, prosperity or hardship, unity or division. By watching how these characters navigate challenges, communities learn the patterns of moral behavior expected of them. These stories do not require formal classrooms or written textbooks. Instead, ethical lessons emerge through the rhythm of storytelling around fireplaces, in initiation ceremonies, during market gatherings, and in rites of passage. Ethics becomes a lived experience, shaped by narratives that reflect the realities of communal life. A key figure who embodies this narrative ethics is the trickster, a character who appears in countless African mythologies. Among the Akan people, Anansi the spider stands as one of the continent's most famous tricksters. Though clever, mischievous, and sometimes deceitful, Anansi serves as a mirror for human behavior. He exposes greed, foolishness, arrogance, and selfishness, often paying a heavy price for his actions. Yet he also demonstrates intelligence, wit, resilience, and creativity, qualities that communities admire. The moral power of the trickster lies in his complexity. He is not a perfect hero nor an irredeemable villain. Instead, he reflects the moral ambiguity of human nature, teaching listeners that ethical growth emerges not from perfection but from the willingness to learn from one's failures. Anansi's tales challenge listeners to consider the motivations behind their actions. When he steals food meant for the entire village, he reveals the dangers of selfishness and the breakdown of communal trust. When he attempts to hoard all the world's wisdom in a pot and fails, he exposes the absurdity of claiming knowledge for oneself alone. And when he uses cleverness to bring stories from the sky god Niame to humanity, he demonstrates that intelligence used for the benefit of others can lead to lasting good. Through these contrasting actions, the stories encourage individuals to examine their own motives, question their impulses, and understand that ethical living requires balancing individual desires with communal needs. Beyond trickster narratives, African myths reinforce moral values by emphasizing the principle of interconnectedness. In many societies, the individual is viewed as part of a larger whole, a family, a clan, a village, a lineage, and a spiritual community that spans the living, the dead, and the unborn. This worldview asserts that personal behavior has communal implications. A single act of dishonesty can damage trust across generations. A moment of courage can inspire unity and resilience. Myths dramatize this principle by showing how heroes succeed only when they act in service of community and how villains fail when they prioritize personal gain over collective well-being. Ethical living, therefore, becomes inseparable from communal responsibility. This emphasis on the communal good appears in myths that highlight reciprocity and mutual support. In many African societies, reciprocity is not merely a social expectation but a moral imperative grounded in cosmological belief. The idea that a person is a person through other people reflects a deep understanding that moral life is relational. Myths depict communities surviving droughts, wars, and spiritual crises only when they work together. When characters act selfishly, ignoring the needs of their neighbors or the warnings of elders, misfortune often follows as a spiritual consequence. These narratives teach that moral behavior sustains not only social harmony but cosmic balance itself. The ethical significance of elders in African mythology is also profound. Elders embody wisdom earned through experience and serve as interpreters of moral tradition. Many myths portray elders as guides who help younger generations navigate life's most difficult dilemmas. Their advice, rooted in ancestral knowledge, carries the weight of spiritual authority. When characters follow the guidance of elders, they often find success or protection. When they ignore these voices of wisdom, they face danger, loss, or humiliation. This narrative pattern teaches respect for knowledge and continuity, reminding listeners that moral decisions should not be made in isolation from history or community. African myths also explore forgiveness, reconciliation, and the restoration of broken relationships. Stories of quarrels between siblings, feuds between clans, or conflicts between humans and spirits emphasize the necessity of reconciliation for societal harmony. Myths depict reconciliation not as a sign of weakness but as an act of moral strength, requiring humility, honesty, and the courage to repair damage. Rituals of apology and cleansing emerge from these stories, demonstrating how narrative ethics shape real-life practices. Through myth, communities learn that wrongdoing is inevitable but that healing is always possible when individuals acknowledge their failures and seek to restore balance. Another powerful ethical theme in African mythology is the value of truth. Stories frequently highlight the consequences of deceit, not only as a moral failure but as a spiritual offense. Truth is associated with purity, balance, and alignment with cosmic order. When characters lie, they often disrupt the harmony between the physical and spiritual realms, leading to misfortune. Conversely, truthfulness brings protection, clarity, and blessings from ancestors or deities. This association teaches communities that truth is not merely a social expectation but a sacred responsibility. African mythology also shapes concepts of justice. Myths often portray justice as restorative rather than punitive, emphasizing the importance of repairing relationships rather than inflicting punishment. When wrongdoers face consequences, these consequences are framed as opportunities for moral growth. A character who steals may be rewarded with wisdom after confessing and making amends. A person who harms the community may regain trust through service and humility. These stories highlight the belief that justice must serve the greater goal of harmony, not vengeance, reminding individuals that ethical living seeks reconciliation over retribution. Gender roles and relationships are also explored through myth. Many African stories portray strong women who exercise wisdom, courage, and leadership. Goddesses, ancestral mothers, and female spirits symbolize fertility, protection, creativity, and moral insight. Their narratives challenge simplistic stereotypes and highlight the balanced relationship between masculine and feminine forces within the cosmos. Ethical teachings therefore promote mutual respect between genders, emphasizing collaboration, balance, and shared responsibility. Through myth, communities learn that moral life flourishes when both men and women contribute their strengths to collective well-being. The ethical frameworks encoded in African mythology continue to influence modern life. Even in urban environments and contemporary political systems, the values of reciprocity, respect, honesty, and communal responsibility remain central to African identity. Storytelling persists as a method of teaching children moral behavior, resolving conflicts, and strengthening social bonds. Television dramas, novels, films, and digital art draw inspiration from ancient myths, adapting ethical narratives to new contexts while preserving their foundational messages. Religious leaders incorporate mythological wisdom into sermons, and traditional elders use stories to guide community decision-making. Ultimately, African mythology presents ethics as a living practice shaped by narrative, memory, and community. It teaches that moral life is not a fixed set of rules but a continuous journey requiring awareness, humility, and interconnectedness. Through characters who stumble and rise, stories that challenge and inspire, and rituals that bind individuals to one another, mythology offers a moral education that is timeless and deeply human. In these narratives, people find models of courage, warnings against folly, and guidance for living well within the complex web of relationships that define existence. Myth becomes both a mirror and a map, reflecting human nature while pointing the way toward harmony, integrity, and collective flourishing. Chapter 5: Legacy of the Storyteller: Myths in Modern Africa. The enduring presence of African mythology in modern society reveals one of the most remarkable truths about the human spirit. Stories never die, they simply continue their journey through new vessels, new languages, and new cultural expressions. In Africa, where oral tradition has always been the spine of community identity, mythology is far more than an artifact of the past. It is a living force that breathes through the continent's art, literature, politics, education, and spiritual imagination. Even in an age of globalization, where digital culture competes for attention and cultural homogenization threatens local identities, African myths persist as anchors of meaning. They serve as reminders of ancestral wisdom, sources of creative power, and frameworks through which individuals and communities continue to interpret their place in the world. To understand the legacy of African storytellers in modern Africa, one must first remember that storytelling was never simply entertainment. In traditional communities, the storyteller carried enormous responsibility. Their voice preserved the collective memory of the group, safeguarded moral values, protected cultural secrets, and justified the legitimacy of political institutions. That same responsibility remains alive today, only expressed through new mediums. The urban novelist, the filmmaker, the poet, the musician, and even the digital content creator all stand in the long lineage of the griots, praise singers, and spiritual custodians who shaped civilization through narrative. As the environment changes, the role of myth adapts, ensuring that the foundations of African identity remain resilient even as societies move toward modernity. One of the most profound ways African myths continue to shape modern culture is through artistic expression. Across the continent, contemporary painters, sculptors, and designers draw inspiration from ancient stories, transforming them into new aesthetics that speak to both past and present. The geometric lines, color gradients, and symbolic patterns seen in modern African art often echo cosmological themes inherited from myth. The Yoruba concept of Ace, the cosmic force that empowers creation, continues to influence Nigerian creatives who express vitality, movement, and spiritual energy in their work. Ghanaian textile makers incorporate Adinkra symbols into modern fashion not only for visual appeal but also to carry forward moral messages hidden within the symbols' historical meanings. Even in large urban centers, murals depicting ancestral spirits, trickster heroes, and creation motifs appear on public walls, reminding communities of the stories that once shaped kingdoms. Modern literature carries an equally powerful imprint of mythology. Writers like Chinua Achebe, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Wole Soyinka, Amos Tutuola, and Ben Okri have all woven myths into contemporary narratives, proving that storytelling is not bound by time. Their works do not merely retell old tales, they reinterpret them to comment on modern struggles such as colonialism, identity conflict, political corruption, and the search for meaning in rapidly changing societies. Achebe's use of Igbo proverbs, cosmological references, and ancestral voices in Things Fall Apart makes the novel both a work of fiction and an anthropological archive. Ben Okri's The Famished Road blurs the boundaries between the physical and spiritual worlds, reflecting a worldview deeply rooted in Nigerian myth that sees existence as fluid and multidimensional. Through such writings, mythology becomes a lens through which modern Africa examines itself, reconciles its past with its present, and imagines new futures. The influence of mythology also extends into political discourse, often in ways that are subtle but significant. Across Africa, leaders frequently draw upon ancestral narratives to justify authority, rally support, or promote national unity. The symbolism used in political campaigns often derives from mythic archetypes and imagery, reinforcing cultural legitimacy. Some liberation movements in southern Africa consciously invoked ancestral spirits and cosmological ideas to fortify their ideological purpose. In many communities, mythical origins continue to justify the existence of royal families or chieftaincy structures, creating a continuity between pre-colonial governance and contemporary political identity. Even modern national mottos, emblems, and flags often integrate mythic symbols, expressing the idea that political identity is inseparable from cultural memory. This blending of mythology and governance demonstrates that stories remain instrumental in shaping not only personal identity but also collective political consciousness. Mythology holds a crucial place in modern religious and spiritual life as well. While Christianity and Islam are dominant across much of Africa today, indigenous beliefs have not disappeared. Instead, they have blended with modern faith practices to form rich, hybrid spiritual landscapes. Many Africans who practice Christianity or Islam still draw upon ancestral myths for moral guidance, protection, healing, and spiritual meaning. Concepts such as the presence of ancestors, the sanctity of natural landmarks, and the importance of ritual purity continue to influence contemporary worship. The Orishas, for example, remain central in Yoruba communities and have also spread globally through diaspora religions such as Santeria, Candomblé, and Vodou. Even in modern African megacities, shrines exist alongside churches and mosques, festivals honoring deities continue to attract thousands, and myths remain essential for interpreting dreams, misfortunes, and blessings. In education, mythology has experienced a renaissance as universities and cultural institutions recognize its importance in preserving identity and promoting critical thinking. Increasingly, schools incorporate folktales, myths, and indigenous knowledge systems into their curricula. This shift is not merely about celebrating tradition, it is also a response to the need for holistic education that reflects African realities rather than relying solely on Western frameworks. Through mythology, students learn not only history but also moral philosophy, conflict resolution, environmental ethics, and artistic creativity. It becomes a tool for cultural affirmation, helping young Africans develop a grounded sense of self in a world that often undervalues their heritage. The revival of cultural festivals, storytelling competitions, and heritage centers demonstrates that African mythology is not trapped in the past but is actively being preserved and revalued for future generations. Music, perhaps more than any other medium, showcases the resilience of myth in modern Africa. Traditional rhythms, chants, and narratives continue to inspire contemporary genres such as Afrobeat, Amapiano, Benga, and High Life. Musicians often reference deities, ancestors, and mythic heroes in their lyrics, weaving ancient meanings into modern soundscapes. Fela Kuti's music, for instance, incorporated Yoruba spiritual themes and mythological symbolism to criticize social injustice and advocate for liberation. Modern artists also draw from myth to construct powerful identities that resonate with audiences who crave cultural authenticity. Even global pop stars of African descent, such as Beyoncé in her Black is King project, have turned to African mythologies to create visually rich narratives that honor African spiritual concepts. Through music, mythology becomes a shared language that links rural traditionalists, urban youth, and the global diaspora. The preservation and reinterpretation of mythology have also become central in debates about cultural identity in the age of globalization. As digital technologies spread, African myths risk dilution or distortion, yet they also gain new platforms for survival. Social media hosts short animations of folktales, podcasts retelling ancient stories, and digital artists recreating mythical characters with futuristic designs. These digital storytellers function much like the griots of old, they safeguard memory while adapting it to contemporary audiences. The global spread of African mythology also counters centuries of misrepresentation, allowing Africans to reclaim stories that colonization once dismissed as primitive. Young creators increasingly engage in cultural reclamation, seeking to correct historical narratives and restore dignity to indigenous knowledge systems. This movement asserts that Africa's past is not a burden but a wellspring of intellectual, artistic, and spiritual wealth. As mythology continues to evolve, questions arise about authenticity, ownership, and interpretation. When ancient stories enter global spaces, they undergo shifts influenced by new cultural contexts. Some fear that these changes may dilute traditional values, while others see them as natural expressions of a living tradition. Mythology is not static, it has always been fluid, reshaped by each generation according to its needs. In this sense, modern reinterpretations do not destroy the old stories but allow them to expand and survive. What matters is not the exact preservation of every detail but the survival of the core values embedded in the myths: community, morality, interconnectedness, reverence for nature, and respect for the ancestors. These values remain relevant even as the world changes, reminding contemporary Africans that they are part of a long continuum of storytelling that has shaped civilizations. Ultimately, the legacy of the storyteller in modern Africa lies not in the stories themselves but in the power they continue to hold. Stories remain the foundation of identity. They root individuals in history, offer moral and spiritual guidance, inspire creativity, and create unity within diversity. Even more importantly, they empower Africans to shape their future through the wisdom of their past. In an age when many societies face crises of meaning, African mythology offers profound insights into resilience, community, and the sacredness of life. Its survival demonstrates that no amount of modernization can erase the human need for narrative, ritual, and belonging. As Africa continues to change, mythology will remain one of its most enduring cultural treasures. The storytellers of today, whether writers, teachers, artists, activists, filmmakers, or digital creators carry the same sacred mandate as their ancestors. They ensure that the fire of memory does not fade, that future generations inherit a sense of place and purpose, and that the continent's vast cultural universe continues to flourish. Mythology will keep evolving, but its essence will stay the same: a source of civilization, a map for moral living, a celebration of spirituality, and a testament to Africa's profound human wisdom. The enduring power of story lies in its ability to transcend time, bridging the ancient and the modern, the physical and the spiritual, the personal and the communal. In this way, myths will continue shaping African identity long into the future, just as they have shaped its past.